Hello, everyone, and welcome back, and welcome to our panelists. My name is Jeff Wiseman. I am a colleague of David's. I am a professor in the Applied Diplomacy program here at DePaul University, and I'm delighted to be moderating, I should say, this session. Now, just a few comments by way of introduction as we think about the future of the Earth's environment. I have to say that I've been increasingly gratified in recent years to witness a surge in scholarly interest in how diplomacy was conducted in Europe before its state system was consolidated, in other parts of the world before the Europeans arrived uninvited, and between the Europeans and indigenous peoples they encountered. Now, it's likewise gratifying to me, as someone who does diplomatic studies, that interest has also revived in how indigenous peoples conducted and continued to conduct their own diplomatic relations and manage their environment. And as Marshall Bayer cautions in a publication, quote, care should be taken to engage indigenous diplomacies as meaningful on their own terms as practices of the present rather than artifacts of the past, unquote. Now, given my Australian roots, you may appreciate that I attach profound importance to this panel on Indigenous voices in global environmental diplomacy. Now, following the three presentations of our speakers, questions can be posed to our panelists, which have been submitted by you, our audience members, via the Q&A tab, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, I think on the right. Please submit your questions as they occur to you during the talks, and we can pose them to our panelists after the three panelists have spoken. So now let us turn to our speakers. And first, I introduce Jessica Shadian, who is the President and CEO of Arctic 360, an organization that brings together northern leaders, global financial institutions, the federal government, and other stakeholders to address infrastructure and related economic development priorities for the North American Arctic. Jessica's work concentrates on the global politics of the Arctic, Arctic Indigenous governance and law, and most recently on the role of global financial institutions in the emerging economy of the North American Arctic. Jessica is the author of The Politics of Arctic Sovereignty, Oil, Ice, and Inuit Governance with Routledge, which is the first in-depth in-depth history of the Inuit Circumpolar Council and Inuit sovereignty in global politics, reaching back to pre-European discovery. Dr. Shadian's consulting work began while living in the Norwegian Arctic as part of becoming the co-creator and organizer of an Arctic dialogue series, which brought together state and local political leaders, oil and gas and other industry leaders, local communities, and academia concerned with Arctic offshore oil and gas development to create and increase information sharing about Arctic resource development. Jessica joins us today, I believe, from Toronto. Welcome, Jessica.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and thank you for that nice introduction. And thank you all for having me. This is exciting, and I really appreciate the invitation. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. So I have a PowerPoint. So I've had some nice discussions now with David, and the other day in our conversation, it was asked to me, well, what's your definition of Indigenous diplomacies? And so I thought I would start today with this as kind of a segue into my presentation, and I'm going to try to go as quick as possible because I know I have a bit here. But in short, I would say, well, maybe another way of asking the question is, instead of how I define it, is, how do we know when we're seeing an instance of Indigenous diplomacies? And in short, I would say that anytime we're seeing Indigenous peoples governing their own lands and waters, controlling their resources, owning their own companies, and moreover, basically every step along the way that it took to get to that point is an instance of Indigenous diplomacy. And so in my own area of research, Indigenous peoples throughout the Arctic, they've basically chosen the route of diplomacy over war. And I also just want to quickly point out that the histories and stories of Indigenous diplomacies are all unique. But where we can see similarities is that in those stories, we'll always find people and leaders that not only basically learn to master the art of dominant state diplomacy, but they also basically figured out how to use the existing institutions and language to make their own case for why land and resources should be returned to them. And so we see examples of this in the case of the Arctic, and specifically looking at the ICC, which Inuit Circumpolar Council, which comprises of the Inuit living in Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Russia. And so we see examples of this by Inuit leaders, from Eben Hobson to Mary Simon, who played such significant roles in settling the Alaskan and Canadian land claims agreements, and not even talking about Greenland. And central to their success was the ability to use and embed into the agreements and the language and ideas that were basically born of and out of international law, that were undergoing their own transformations at the same time, and very much because of those same leaders. So what I'm going to do today basically is I'm going to try to summarize my earlier writing on how the ICC and Inuit leaders engaged in Inuit diplomacies to regain control over their land and resources, and also those accompanying governance structures that were created. But I also want to pick up where my story left off. So I basically left off in the midst of this shift that was taking place in the international arena. And it was the one from the discourse of sustainable development to a focus on climate change, and basically questioning then what that might mean for Indigenous rights and in Indigenous diplomacy going forward. And so what I'm going to do then is look at what I see as basically a new phase of Inuit and Arctic Indigenous diplomacies. And so maybe we could say it's like this. There's two phases of Inuit diplomacy. And so phase one is the political diplomacy, and more recently phase two, which we can call basically economic diplomacy. But the reality is, there's one thing to attain political authority and the right to govern, but running any type of government or being able to grow prosperous and sustainable communities, it requires economic self-determination. And so perhaps for even, two sides of the same coin, political self-determination and economic self-determination are interdependent. And so when I first wrote my chapter on Indigenous diplomacies and the ICC, the focus was really about the governance aspect of diplomacy. So we saw at the domestic level, this was, really a story about how Inuit diplomacy led to settling Alaskan land claims agreements and the governance structures those created, also in Canada, from the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement to the Nunavut Agreement and all the way over through to Greenland. At the Arctic regional level, I also looked at the Arctic Council and how basically Inuit use the international language of Indigenous rights and sustainable development. So when the Arctic Council actually came to fruition, the Inuit Circumpolar Council not only had a seat at the table alongside 8 Arctic states, but the very mandate of the Arctic Council, including ensuring sustainable development of the Arctic. And sustainable development itself was defined and understood to be as developing and protecting the Arctic in collaboration with its Indigenous populations. And so at the international level, I looked at this intersecting discourses between international human rights, the human rights regime, and UN discussions about sustainable development. So Inuit, alongside other, their Indigenous colleagues, put forward the argument that basically Indigenous peoples have safeguarded the earth for thousands of years. And clearly, given the environmental degradation taking place, the world needs them to ensure that life on Earth will continue. They also argued that, it was not enough to say that Indigenous peoples are stakeholders, like, other NGOs, like Greenpeace, Save the Children. And so Inuit in the international Indigenous movement borrowed from the Inuit UN human rights language of self-determination and defined Indigenous self-determination based on Indigenous conceptions of and relations to land, water, resources, knowledge, and history. And so this notion then fit perfectly into the other emerging international discourse of sustainable development. And so the final culmination, at the international level, then of course was the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And for Inuit, this equated to basically Inuit being as right holders when it comes to development of Inuit land and resources. So it's a concept that challenges traditional assumptions of, about sovereignty in the state, but it was also something that the Inuit have used domestically and regionally. And so the aim has really never been to undermine the international political process, but rather to become part of those processes as a distinct political actor rather than a state, and changing those institutions along the way. So then we have the Rio conference, okay? And I would say this is the moment between phase 1 and phase 2. So in April 2009, the UN and the ICC, they co-hosted a summit on climate change to discuss the IPCC report, and they wanted to draft a document that they were going to take to COP15 about its implications for Indigenous peoples. But the summit basically ended without a consensus because there were 2 calls. And so the first was phasing out fossil fuels altogether and putting a moratorium on anything new. And the second was for a process that would phase out fossil fuels, but more significantly, without infringing on the development rights of Indigenous peoples. And so that's where we were starting to see the beginning of some kind of schism. where basically there were those indigenous peoples who believed that climate change was essentially, a product of neoliberal capitalism, and other indigenous peoples who are actually working to become owners, co-managers, equity investors in non-renewable resource projects on their own lands, basically deciding how they wanted to develop those resources themselves. And so whereas sustainable development gave indigenous peoples, in theory, the authority to develop their resources, control their lands as they saw fit, with the idea that, of course, they knew how, the climate crisis narrative suddenly creates this like narrowed parameter for indigenous diplomacy, and indigenous peoples were suddenly being forced then to align themselves. They're either victims of climate change or they're turning their back on their own place in global politics, right, as the Earth's true environmental stewards. And so for Inuit diplomacy in particular, this becomes even more acute, right? Because given the Inuit live in the Arctic, they're like literally truly on the front lines of climate change. And so the question I left off with earlier was, well, then is there a space for indigenous diplomacies at the table when we're talking about climate change? Are they just merely the visual imagery, of being the victims on the front lines? And if they're just the victim, then where does that leave Inuit communities that basically engaged in decades of political diplomacy to be able to exert control over their own development and therefore their own destinies? So, okay, enter today. Phase 2, economic diplomacy. It may seem I'm all over the place, but I'm not. So 2018, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, he published this letter. He's probably one of the most powerful persons in the institutional investor space, and he publishes a letter, and he addresses it to the world's global financial institutions. And he says, corporations need to find their moral purpose. So in response, we had this rise of this idea called, environmental, social, and governance, ESG, and it became almost, self-appointed as important as doing financial auditing. And at that time, the point of the focus was really on the E, because global investors, they set out, they wanted to demonstrate basically all the ways in which they're meeting their responsibility to combat climate change. And so a driving sentiment behind many of those efforts then has been this notion, well, if we could save the Arctic from development, we could save the Earth from climate change. And so what emerged with this notion of the Arctic snow globe, an Arctic that can be bottled up and placed on a shelf, safeguarded from the rest of the world. Essentially, the Arctic became the narrative of convenience for the global investment community. So it begins with this idea of the Arctic as a bellwether for climate change, a vast sprawl of frozen tundra, melting icebergs, with polar bears. And then, of course, the indigenous people who basically need to be saved by the world outside. And so for many financial institutions, this popular conception has offered a very convenient means for making these sweeping statements, symbolic gestures, internal policies, without actually doing anything to demonstrate what their institution is doing to be good corporate citizens. But the problem is that their statements are based on false assumptions about the Arctic. And just to quickly clarify, and I know this from my climate change scientist friends and colleagues. So basically we know that CO2 emissions, wherever they originate, they basically, impact the whole globe. But we also know that they most drastically affect the Arctic. But the reason for this is that the CO2 emissions, they travel through the jet stream. So from wherever they began, and the jet stream goes north and south, right? And so if they began in LA, Saudi Arabia, it's always going to end up in the Arctic, or they're going to end up in the Antarctic. So if we actually want to lower the amount of CO2 we have in the air, and especially if you want the Arctic to stop melting, then we really need to focus on where the source of emissions are originating, not where they end up. Okay, so going back to the whole piece on ESG. So ESG, it's become synonymous with climate change. And because the Arctic and its indigenous peoples are this visual expression of climate change, well, then too often the discussion about addressing climate change is, well, let's save the Arctic from development rather than actually fixing the problem. And so the Arctic's indigenous peoples have suddenly, they're finding themselves now, again, being spoken about. Sometimes they're informed and maybe even consulted, rather though than actually being seen as ultimate decision makers over their own lands and resources. And so, because after all, saving the Arctic and its polar bears has significant emotional appeal, and it makes great PR, right? So what we're actually seeing then is the same old colonial discourse born from the origins of the social contract being revived and made to basically fit, the 21st century climate crisis. And I think Jean-Jacques Simard's writings about European notions of the native fit so well into how global financial institutions regard the Arctic and those living there. So in his writings, he writes, the native as a museum specimen that has to be protected, preserved, and displayed as a living testimonial to what artificial civilization destroys. Forever, he would exhibit what civilized man has ravaged. He was expected to serve as the enduring model for natural social conditions before the fall, an exemplar for those seeking restitution. So I think Barclays, which was one of the first ones to put out this one of these statements, was their climate and energy strategy. It's a perfect example of this. So the strategy talks about offering these attractive investment opportunities that's going to come from the transition to a low carbon economy, and they're going to begin with these climate change mitigation investments, and then it discusses the bank's approach to sensitive energy sectors. So what they talk about specifically is Arctic oil and gas, where they say that anyone who wants to engage in Arctic oil and gas project is just going to be subject to this enhanced due diligence process. And they state, but we would never expect such a project to be able, any project proposal to meet our criteria. So basically, if you're going to do anything Arctic, then forget about it. Interestingly enough, though, the strategy acknowledges that oil and gas is going to be the main source of energy for decades to come, and quote, reliance on gas as a transition fuel is expected to increase. And I think that's important. I'll come back to it. So in the short term, their investments are going to continue to be in oil and gas elsewhere all around the world. And so then the strategy turns specifically to Indigenous peoples. And they say, climate change and social issues are linked, and Indigenous peoples are disproportionately affected. And that is why Barclays now is implying this enhanced due diligence to transactions that will have a direct impact on Indigenous peoples. And specifically, they talk about free, informed, and prior consent. But the fact is, if Barclays actually did their own early engagements, they might have heard the responses coming from many Arctic Indigenous leaders who argue that because of decades-long economic neglect, they actually are not even able to be resilient to the forces of climate change they didn't create. And one Arctic Indigenous Sami leader, I think, stated it perfectly when she said that as an Indigenous people, we not only carry the burden of climate change, but we also carry the burden of mitigation. And so coming back to my earlier statement, so while the strategy states basically that, affordable energy, and that's why there's going to be this gas transition, is critical for functioning economies and its citizens globally, it appears that the same expectations just don't exist for Indigenous communities and others who live in the Arctic. It appears, basically, who cares if they have a means to affordable energy? We just cannot have oil or gas development in the Arctic, period. And so similarly, we see this with the retailing industry. Shipping companies are making their own announcements. So Nike signed an Arctic shipping corporate pledge that will say no, it's not going to ship anything through the Arctic. However, again, it's about the jet stream. And the most immediate concern should be on the Suez and Panama canals, right? Which counts for about 2% of global emissions. So before we're going to have like sneakers going through the Arctic, the global shipping industry is actually going to be carbon emission free. Norwegians have hybrid ships. Maersk is going to be carbon free by 2025. Instead, the point is that by putting the Arctic in a snow globe, they're actually contributing to this ongoing economic neglect, which is equated to a real basic lack of infrastructure, housing, roads, clean water, healthcare. And so when they say that they're going to boycott, resource investment outright, then basically they're telling those, those communities are losing opportunities to become equity owners and grow their own economies and self-sufficiency. And I don't have time to get into some other pieces. I mean, at the same time, a lot of Inuit, they have a lot of gas on their own lands, right? And so if we want to put science, in front of PR, we can ask whether gas development owned by Inuit could actually displace coal emissions from, coal factories in China and remove reliance on fuel. So, the same communities that have a lot of gas right now, they're reliant on importing diesel. And because it's being imported, it's rationed, and therefore it's expensive, and many people can't even afford, to meet their own energy needs. And so the fact is that, global financial institutions, they can have an important and positive role to play when it comes to Arctic and its Indigenous communities, in terms of helping to build infrastructure, critical infrastructure from roads to runways, internet. we actually need, so more goods can come in from food staples and building supplies, medical equipment that can actually be shipped to the Arctic. But basically the heart of this discussion though is how in the name of climate change, institutional investors are undermining Indigenous peoples, the authority to develop their own lands and resources, the very basis of what they've been actually diplomatically fighting for, they did for so many decades, which was self-determination. And so while there's been so much success, I would say, with political diplomacy, I would argue that the current state of economic Indigenous diplomacy is really in the midst of a revolution. And so I will just say two things in conclusion. First of all, what we're seeing right now in terms of economic diplomacy is that Indigenous groups are really spending their diplomatic efforts right now on making the world and global capital understand that basically if you want to satisfy your ESG, be a good corporate citizen, have a moral purpose, you need to not only cooperate with Indigenous peoples, but by actually bringing them in as co-investors and equity owners, that's going to actually be helping improve their lives. And I don't know if I have one more minute to say one thing.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes.
Because I was asked the question, sorry if I flew through it quickly, but I was asked, one of my questions is to give some ideas about where diplomacy needs to go to adequately address the environmental crisis. And so I've had a few thoughts about this, and I just think, based on what we're seeing right now with the investment community, my suggestion would be this. I think it's important for people to not romanticize Indigenous experiences, lives, cultures, etc., because romanticizing is very different than respecting or showing empathy, and it certainly does not help empower people. At the end of the day, Indigenous people, they really want the same thing as everyone else. They want to afford food for themselves and their families, have access to housing that's safe and affordable, clean drinking water, be able to freely practice their cultures, be able to send their kids to good schools and universities, and fundamentally have safety, security, and economic opportunity. So just as anyone who lives outside the Arctic, wakes up or cares basically about the environment, is scared to death about what climate change is doing to the earth, has to wake up every day and make a trade-off, right? We know hydrocarbons are bad, but we still rely on it in most cases to heat our homes. We still take airplanes from time to time. We still want to use our ovens to cook. We still order goods from Amazon that very likely arrive to its packaging center via China by ship. We want broadband, and we rely on massive amounts of energy to store the information that we put on our computers every day. Well, Indigenous peoples wake up every day having to make the same trade-offs and decisions. The point is they also deserve to have the same rights to make those trade-offs every day, and also the same amenities to be able to make those same choices themselves, whether it's to heat their home or store their information on the cloud. So when it comes to Indigenous diplomacies, I just think it's high time to see more Indigenous diplomacy, which is really what's happening and what we're starting to see, but for the world to recognize it, taking place inside boardrooms of major corporations, and more of those corporations basically to be outright Indigenous owned. So I'll just leave it at that.
Jessica, thank you for a highly informative and absolutely riveting account of your research and the subjects that interest you and all of us. So thanks again. And just to remind people that as you do think of questions, do post them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And Jessica, we hope that we look forward to coming back to you in a little while when we hear from our other two panelists. Now, our second panelist for now is Hayden King. And Hayden King is an Anishinaabe from Beausoleil First Nation on Geotimnisting. Hayden is the Executive Director and the Senior Editor at Yellowhead Institute, as well as Advisor to the Dean of Arts on Indigenous Education at Ryerson University in Toronto. His research and analysis on the Canada Indigenous relationship, including the seminal Land Back Red Paper on Indigenous land and environmental rights, is published widely. Hayden's research engages Indigenous nationhood and colonialism in Canada. He has served as the Senior Policy Advisor to the Ontario Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs and as Director of Research at the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. He is the author of Planning the Final Frontier, Land and Resource Management, Indigenous Self-Determination, and the Canadian North. Hayden joins us today from Toronto. Welcome, Hayden.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And yeah, thanks for that introduction, and to Jessica for that presentation, which certainly provokes many questions for me. I think that what I'm going to speak about goes in different directions, but I think that the underlying principle of self-determination is a through line in both of our presentations. So I'm a researcher, I'm a writer, I'm an organizer. I do this work primarily through Yellowhead Institute, which is an Indigenous research center in Toronto, Ontario. And we focus on working with the land back movement. So these are primarily grassroots youth Indigenous land defenders. In some cases, they are First Nations. In some cases, they're treaty organizations. And the work that we try to do really supports and amplifies the voices of those who are asserting and enforcing their jurisdiction over their lands, maybe in less formal and sometimes more provocative venues. So I want to talk a little bit about how this work gives me a somewhat unique perspective on the concept of diplomacy and diplomacy as it relates to global survival. And before I get into, I suppose, the bulk of my remarks, I want to begin with a story that I hope is not so romantic, but grounds me in a lot of the work that I do, and helps me, well, I think helps communicate the type of philosophy and perspective that Anishinaabe people and a lot of Indigenous land defenders embed themselves in when they do this work. And it's a story, sometimes it's called the Moose Thieves, sometimes it's called the War of the Moose. It's a story that we tell to Anishinaabe children. And it basically goes like this, that one day the people woke up and decided to hunt the moose and the deer because it was the fall harvest. But the people, they couldn't find any tracks, and this wasn't unusual. It just meant that they had to travel further and look more closely. But after many days of hunting the deer and the moose, they still couldn't find any tracks, and days stretched on to weeks. And they, of course, were very concerned. And so they asked the muskrat if they'd seen the deer and the moose, and the muskrat wouldn't talk to them. And they asked the bear, and they asked the snake, and none of the other creatures would talk to the people about where the deer and the moose had gone. And so the people continued to search, starving at this point, until a young hunter discovered that the crows and the owls had been kidnapped by the deer and the moose had been kidnapped by the crows and the owls. And so the people decided they had to wage a war against the crows and the owls, and they fought to recapture the deer and the moose, and the war waged for weeks as well. And finally, the people, the Anishinaabe, got to the deer and the moose, and they say, "Look, we've freed you. Come with us back to our territory." And the deer and the moose sort of shook their head at the Anishinaabe and said, "No, you don't understand. We went with the crows and the owls voluntarily. We sought their protection because you had forgotten your obligations to us. You had stopped performing ceremony when we sacrificed ourselves. You were not putting down tobacco. You were wasting our flesh. You were not ensuring that our territory would be there for future generations." And so the people understood that the deer and the moose fled because they had forgotten what their responsibilities were to the land. And the people decided there with the deer and the moose to create a new treaty, a treaty that would bind them to each other and spell out the obligations and responsibilities to each other. This is, for the Anishinaabe, one of the origin stories for our diplomatic practice with the land. So I tell this story, and I tell the story often, and I talk to the story about my kids and our relatives. It was Thanksgiving here in Canada, and we talked about this story. And I think a pertinent question maybe for our conversation here is, what would it mean to refocus our notions of diplomacy away from relationships with states, international organizations, maybe finance, towards one between political communities and the land? We have a sense of how it currently operates in Canada and the United States, and in my view, it is not working. The countries that we call home, Canada and the United States, were established via fraudulent norms and principles, international norms and principles. Some of the first, actually, papal bulls that permitted colonization if no Christians could be found. And the Spanish and the Portuguese and the English and French took advantage of these norms. And the doctrine of discovery allowed state governments to emerge and allowed the dispossession of Indigenous people who had their own laws, governments, and societies. And while I won't recite the history of colonization, the salient point here is that the institutions of these young countries sprung up to protect the interests of settlers and then states and provinces and territories. In a Canadian context, the right for provinces and territories to exploit the land, though less so territories, is constitutionally protected. Of course, Indigenous people, with some exceptions in later treaties, what we call modern treaties, were not asked about this arrangement. And so today, when there's a decision to permit a natural gas pipeline or a gold mine, conflict very often does emerge between two competing perspectives on who actually owns the land. And the subtext here, or a parallel clash, is around what our obligations are to the land. And the conflict unfolds in a predictable formula. Industry begins exploring or building infrastructure for resource extraction. Indigenous peoples are notified, often through environmental assessment processes, and organized to have dialogue around the project. That dialogue is often rejected unless, of course, those Indigenous communities or groups accept the project. Indigenous people then reoccupy the land or erect a blockade, protest the development. Companies seek injunctions, courts issue injunctions and force them to leave their own territories, by the way. Police enforce the injunction, which results in violence. Now, in a conference such as this, some might excuse this dynamic as domestic unrest, but I see it as diplomacy and productive tension that allows for critical conversations and, in some case, even an end to exploitative development. So effective diplomacy. Now, in some cases, governments actually engage in negotiation when these issues arrive, engage in a different type of diplomacy. And we can look to the very first modern treaty as an example emerging from this type of clash. However, more often than not, they prefer to channel this type of resistance into formal processes instead. So national and international environmental climate regulation discussions are an example of this. Indigenous representatives are now invited to COP conference, and motions towards Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge are included in Canadian laws. Yet, as Ariel Deranger at Indigenous Climate Action points out, these forms of inclusion are generally limited to the superficial. Indigenous Climate Action's recent report, Decolonizing Climate Policy in Canada, reviews both the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, released in 2016, and a more recent, A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy, released in 2020, to determine whether or not climate policy and planning in Canada includes effective participation of Indigenous people and inclusion of Indigenous rights. And Indigenous Climate Action found that while Indigenous people are referenced repeatedly in both of these reports, in fact 168 times, there is a structural exclusion from decision-making tables. Both reports were developed without direct engagement or consultation with Indigenous communities and nations, and without participation at any of the expert tables that provided recommendations for these plans. So ICA argues that this constitutes a violation of the rights of Indigenous people and the right to self-determination, and of course, free, prior, and informed consent as defined by the United Nations in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I think that this is all the more shocking when you consider what Indigenous land management can contribute towards mitigating and adapting climate change. In 2019, the United Nations Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Economic Systems found that human activities are rapidly stripping the planet of biodiversity, contributing to the ecological devastation wrought by climate change. 1 million species are at risk of extinction. While an apocalyptic future certainly awaits without transformative change, the report found some hope in the land management practices of Indigenous people globally. While biodiversity is declining in all parts of the world, it is declining much less rapidly in those lands managed by Indigenous communities. Indeed, in some of those areas, there's actually an enhancement of conservation through Indigenous practices of land restoration and sustainable use of the land. Not surprisingly, this leads to improved quality of life. The report finds that Indigenous people maintain so much biodiversity where others have not, because they often manage the land and coastal areas, quote, they often manage the land and coastal areas based on culturally specific worldviews, applying principles and indicators such as the health of the land, caring for the country, and reciprocity. Principles like treaty making with the land. When we wrote the 2019 Land Back report, we found that this type of diplomacy takes all types of forms, from environmental assessment and management to reoccupations of the land and the blockade as diplomacy, as I mentioned earlier, to Indigenous forms of consent, or in other words, consent processes that industry and governments are required to pursue before any development proceeds. And this isn't to say that Indigenous peoples are opposed to development. Certainly, Niskandiga First Nation in Northwestern Ontario speaks about how development is something desired by the community, but it has to respect Indigenous jurisdiction, and it has to be on terms that also respect the laws, the Indigenous laws of the land. So there's an important distinction to be made there. So for me, I think diplomacy is about Indigenous self-determination. And in this talk, I've been asked to offer recommendations. The UN has made some things like supporting Indigenous knowledge systems and bringing those into federal climate policy, creating a space for community-based land management practices like guardian programs or species at risk community laws, even moving towards the concept of free, prior, and informed consent at the national state level. But each of these suggestions rely on the goodwill of states, many of whom have an interest, to put it bluntly, in crushing Indigenous decision-making power or crushing Indigenous dissent when it conflicts with provincial, territorial, or state interests in the land. And so we have to find ways to talk about environmental diplomacy outside of ways that I think many of us have been trained. Certainly I was trained in my PhD on international relations to think about diplomacy outside of the state system, outside of international organizations, and outside of international financial institutions, and towards thinking of diplomacy or rethinking diplomacy as with the land. So that's all I have to say for now, and I'm looking forward to some conversation.
Hayden, well, thanks very much for that terrific perspective and the way that you have invited us to think about diplomacy more broadly is really, I think, extremely useful in terms of the goals of the conference. Yes, diplomacy needs to be unmoored from the sovereign state, as I think several speakers have said, and you've taken it without using the term in the trans-professional direction. You've invoked the need for multi-vocational and multi-disciplinary approaches to diplomacy, and this is, of course, music to my ears and to many of us in the seminar today. I also was very struck by your idea of structural exclusion. And again, I hope, we can all go away and think about basically what you're reminding us to do with that particular concept. So thank you, Hayden. And again, a reminder to people who are sitting in the audience, please submit any questions you might have to Jessica, to Hayden, or to our next speaker through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Leona Morgan. And Leona, I see you behind a very intriguing let's say, symbol there. So thank you so much. And again, if you do feel inclined to tell us the background to that symbol, which some of us will recognize, that would be fantastic. But you are very, very welcome to this panel. And again, to introduce you to other people attending today, Leona is a co-founder of the Nuclear Issues Study Group. She is a Dine or Navajo community organizer and leading advocate for communities in New Mexico impacted by uranium mining and proposals for temporary storage of radioactive waste, and a term I think that you're very familiar with, Leona, consolidated interim storage, or CIS. Leona's work focuses then on safety issues surrounding uranium mines, the transport of uranium and storage of nuclear waste, and she joins us today from Albuquerque. Welcome, Leona.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here and honored to be on such a distinguished panel. I have some slides to share if people have questions to illustrate some of the points I'm making. Today, I'm just going to talk. I appreciate all of the information that was already shared. I have a lot more, and I think my presentation is a little bit different because like Jeffrey said, I'm an activist. So I don't practice or work on diplomacy in a professional manner or representing my nation at all. In fact, quite the opposite. I think I take the liberty as an activist to sometimes, push the envelope. But I'll explain as I get into my presentation. First, I just want to restart by introducing myself to my relatives out there. Hello, I am Dinette, and I just shared my clans. For those of you who might be Dinette, I'm usually a grandma. And so I have 2 water clans, and I didn't really understand the meaning of this growing up until I found the work that I do, which actually didn't happen until after I attended the University of New Mexico. And so I'm just going to give a little bit of background about myself, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and maybe, I don't know if they're recommendations, but my perspective on how I think diplomacy or bridge building really needs to take place, especially in the United States when dealing with nuclear issues. So just a little bit of my background. I grew up in I grew up on the state line of Arizona and New Mexico near a border town called Gallup, New Mexico. And so I lived on the Navajo Nation. I grew up on the res my whole life. And then I went to high school in this border town, which was very near one of the world's largest one of the world's largest contaminated sites and the world's largest uranium spill, which took place in 1979, just about 15 miles from where I went to school, maybe 20 miles. And we were downstream. The city of Gallup is downstream, as well as other cities. And I'll get to that. But essentially, we were never taught this growing up about the uranium problem. And so across the country, we have over 15,000 abandoned uranium mines. And in 2006 and 2007, the price of uranium shot up very high, very quickly. And a lot of the places where uranium was mined in the past, especially for the Manhattan Project, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the Manhattan Project. It was in order to basically to show the United States imperialist world dominance. They created this nuclear weapon that was first tested in New Mexico. And so here in New Mexico, we have many nuclear sites. And so the history in this country, when we're learning as students in elementary school, we are not taught about the nuclear tests that took place in this country. So over 1,000 tests in Nevada, below ground and above ground. And so essentially most of us are at least east of those tests, most of us are downwinders. And on the Navajo Nation specifically, we have what's identified by the federal government as 524 abandoned uranium mines. So I said 15,000 in the whole country. On Navajo, they identified about 524, but the community people who live near these sites know there's a lot more. So maybe even close to 2,000. And there's no law in the country to clean up these sites. And so today we're dealing with a lot of the legacy effects, contaminated water, health effects. My family lives in an area where there was a lot of mining. And so I've had a lot of relatives who have had illnesses that are listed on the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act listing for health problems that are attributed to uranium mining. And so I definitely blame the uranium industry for killing several of my family members, unknown at the time, because we didn't really know what the effects of radiation exposure were in the beginning. And so when the boom happened in like the 50s and the 60s, and it pretty much slowed down in the early 80s. And so the latency period for some of these health effects, especially cancer, doesn't occur for a couple of decades. So people really didn't know about the true danger of uranium mining until well after the industry had already set up shop, contaminated the area, and in some cases was already gone. And so right now we have, there's one specific case in New Mexico that's very relative right now as it's going through a cleanup, and they're taking public comments right now until actually till the end of the month. And across the country, there are several nuclear projects ongoing with open comment periods. And so I'm kind of explaining the history of just the uranium mining and the mess it left across the country. So the mining, in areas where there was mining, a lot of us, especially on Navajo, I'm not going to lie or project, but I truly believe that every single Diné person knows someone who's been touched by uranium and hurt by uranium. And so as a nation, we actually have a law against uranium mining. So as Navajo Nation, we also have a law against the transport of radioactive materials. And these laws, they're great when it comes to what we can control within our legal jurisdiction, which is Navajo Indian country, because it's very complex. We have a checkerboard area. Because of the Dawes Act, we have this unique area, especially around the railroads, in what's called Eastern Navajo in northwestern New Mexico. It's one of the most complex areas because the jurisdiction varies from section to section and even from quarter section, as well as, on the surface and then subsurface. So there's just a mix of private land, state land, federal land, Navajo trust land, Navajo allotment land, Navajo fee land, and then sometimes, like I mentioned, the split estate. So it can be very complicated when someone is trying to address these issues. So like an activist like myself, a community person that's not trained in this, it took a couple of years to just understand the complexity when the specific issue of Church Rock, again, I mentioned the world's largest uranium spill, that occurred northeast of Gallup, and that radioactive water, when it happened on July 16th, 1979, there was over 90 million gallons of radioactive waste that spilled from a dam wall that was already cracked. So this company was mining and milling near a Diné community and using a waste cell that was already compromised, and they knew it and they kept using it, kept putting in waste. And on July 16th, that dam broke, and then that water spilled into the desert environment where there was no rain and no moisture, but all of a sudden the community was wondering, why is the wash full of water? So, animals were getting into it, kids were playing in it, that kind of thing. This has never been studied. A lot of people don't know about this. The reason I bring it up and I'm explaining it is because when that water went from that facility, it was on private land, and then it entered into an unnamed ditch, which I'm not sure if it was state land or res land, but it eventually got into the river. And then that river flowed from New Mexico into Arizona. So with this particular situation, I know I'm going to try to explain it, but I'm probably leaving some things out. It started in northwestern New Mexico It started in EPA Region 6 out of Texas, and then US EPA Region 6, and then it flowed into Arizona. So it passed county lines, state lines, it went through a municipality, and it's going in and out of the res, depending where the river is flowing. And then into Arizona, it entered into EPA Region 9, which actually oversees the cleanup. So this was back in '79. And so while that waste had no idea itself where it was going, it was just, following its natural flow. It was passing through several types of land statuses, different types of land use areas, including, farming and grazing areas. And it went through several places where people had no idea what was in this stuff. And today, there is a young Diné scientist working on his postdoc to try to find the source of some contamination that we believe was from this spill. So this spill happened in 1979. In 2015, a Diné community downstream got a notice from their water utility company that there was over twice the legal limit of uranium in their drinking water. And they were advised to drink maybe less than a liter a day, not to make the baby's formula with this water, basically to use as little water as possible. So this is the notice they got in the mail on August 4th, 2015. The next day was the Gold King mine spill. So a lot of the attention from the Navajo Nation, from the local regulatory authorities was shifted to that spill. And so these people that were living in this community today, the source of their drinking water has changed, but the plumbing infrastructure is still what it was when they were getting contaminated water. So I'm bringing up all of these issues because it brings into play different agencies on the state level, on the tribal level, on the national level, on the federal level. And when it comes down to it, uranium and the use of uranium today is depending the mining, let's take that aside because there's such things as agreement states. I don't want to get into that, but essentially the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, oversees pretty much all of the nuclear activities when it comes to commercial use of uranium. And then of course the federal government is in charge of the military use of uranium. And so for us, our people, we're living in these places where we have uranium. Indigenous peoples all over the world have been affected by uranium mining. We're estimating, the estimate is about 70% of impacts are to Indigenous peoples. Those are the frontline community folks living in these places and really getting those firsthand impacts without proper cleanup, notification, all of these issues. A lot of them were already spoken about by our first two guests. Now, I'm just painting this picture of the legacy. Now move forward to what's happening today with climate change. We're experiencing, especially in Indigenous communities, people who are very connected to the land. We saw this decades ago. And right now, the United Nations has been in their planning for addressing this through their meetings, the convening of parties. So the United Nations COP meetings. We have COP26 coming up here in a couple of weeks in Glasgow, Scotland. And internationally, I also am in communication with people fighting nuclear all over the world, because what's happening now is there's this idea that nuclear is going to save us and is going to be this magic transition energy that's going to carry us from fossil fuels into the future, whatever that is. But we don't know what the future is. And so right now, there's a really strong push for what's called small modular nuclear reactors, or these different kinds of what they call new technology. When it comes to nuclear, there's not a lot of new technology that's being developed right now. There's a lot of things being proposed, but what we know about nuclear is it's very expensive. It can't exist without taxpayer dollars, and it's very, very slow. And so right now we're in a world where there's a strong push for new nuclear, when a lot of us living in these areas are still experiencing the legacy effects. And so specifically in the United States, we're going through an interesting period because right now the conversation is about diplomacy. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not, this is a new area for me, especially as an activist. And for myself, I find myself in different arenas and on various levels, because when I'm working on these issues as a community activist and organizer, I'm at the community level trying to educate my people and talking to people on some level of connecting on the impacts. So a lot of us, like I said, have family that we've lost. So there's that kind of connection that I make with the community members, and I try to, as much as possible, use simple language when I'm talking about nuclear issues, because they designed this, what's called nuke speak, as a way to keep the general public, in the dark. And so when the Atomic Energy Commission first formed, back in the mid 20th century, a lot of the push was for war and weapons and imperialism. But today we're looking more at the use of energy. But both of these two are huge economic drivers. And so in the United States, you might have heard a lot about the reconciliation bill and the infrastructure bill and all of the stuff that Biden's doing. And it's all related because there's a lot of money in these federal budgets and different appropriations. A lot of times there's money for nuclear research, especially for weapons. And then right now we're dealing with bailouts to nuclear energy companies. So I just want to wrap up by, I want to put out a lot of these issues as problems, and maybe some of the questions we can come back to the recommendations. But the reason I'm setting up this whole scenario is because right now we have over 80,000 metric tons of high-level radioactive waste from all of the nuclear power plants in the country, and there's nowhere to put it. The United States has not come up with a plan to put it anywhere forever. This stuff will be radioactive for a long time, tens of thousands into millions of years, and it's the most radioactive stuff on the planet. There's nowhere to put it, and they're exploring bringing it to New Mexico. In the 80s, they also were trying to push for putting it on reservations. And so what do we do with this nuclear waste? And the NRC, they don't explain these really complex things to our nations, yet they're pushing these projects. In Church Rock, there's a really bad cleanup project they're pushing. The NRC is currently going through a public comment period to improve on their environmental justice policy. Now, this is not the same as tribal consultation. When we're talking about sovereignty, we definitely need to fix the issues when it comes to government communication, because the NRC has been really disrespectful when it comes to communicating with our tribal leaders, our nation, our Navajo Nation officials, as well as our community organizations. And then when it comes to people like me, who's an activist, 2 weeks ago, I was an invited guest on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission panel to talk about how the Nuclear Regulatory Commission can improve on how it communicates and outreaches to EJ communities. And when I was explaining about doctrine of discovery, the facilitator said, well, thank you, Leona, for educating us on discovery. And I lost it. In that sense, I was not diplomatic at all. And so the NRC, they cut off my microphone while I was just about to explain that the process they were taking was perpetuating white supremacy and oppression. And this is not the way that we speak to one another. So this is the current process right now that I'm going through, is addressing the federal government on one level, working with my Navajo Nation and engaging with them on another level, as well as community people, and then the general public. And I didn't even get into working with white allies. That's a whole nother arena when it comes to diplomacy. I know it's different, but it's been a real interesting time with the movement of decolonization and anti-oppression, especially in a very white movement of anti-nuclear work. So I'll just stop there. I know I do have some recommendations about, of course, FPIC and government to government communications, but I think a lot of it was already covered by the first two presenters. Thank you very much.
Leona, again, thank you so much for bringing to our attention what is, clearly a forgotten, a neglected, an unfairly treated issue. And I do come from Australia, as I mentioned earlier. Australia is a miner of uranium. It is, it has a long tradition of mining in areas that are that were basically indigenously inhabited areas. And so many of these problems we have seen in Australia as well. And I'm so grateful for you to bring them to our attention. What you've also done is brought to our attention one of the central dilemmas of climate change. And that is, the idea that nuclear power can in fact be the panacea, the solution, the magic bullet, if you like, for climate change. And so I was fascinated and delighted to hear you raise that issue because nuclear power is presented as a clean source of power. And so I wanted to ask you first, Leona, if I could, and then ask Jessica and Hayden as a part of this dilemma, this central dilemma of climate change. What is your community's view, Leona, about the alternatives, solar and wind? I certainly understand how they feel about nuclear, but can you tell us if you've had discussions in your work about solar and wind and whether that is seen as, let's say, a solution that is a much more preferable one? And then I want to ask Jessica and Hayden, perhaps in that order, how your communities, if at all, have considered this issue, this dilemma of nuclear power being a potential solution to the climate change problem, which is one of the biggest problem, arguably, of the day, putting aside the pandemic. So, Leona, would you like to go first?
Sure, thank you. And yes, the symbol is, I borrowed the anti-nuclear symbol from Australia, from Indigenous people there who are also fighting uranium mining. Well, I think the obvious answer is that we don't need nuclear. We don't need to keep taking uranium out of the ground. In fact, if we don't have a place for the waste, we really need to stop making new waste. All of the lived experiences of Indigenous peoples around uranium mining are the reasons why nuclear is not a solution to climate change, because the human rights aspect cannot be ignored. But when you go into the science of it, there has been some work to try to calculate what's called the front end. So when they calculate the carbon output of nuclear, it's only at the power plant, which is mostly just steam and radiation, because it's basically a big pot of boiling water. And then the mining, the processing, the fuel fabrication, the transportation, none of that is counted in the carbon output of nuclear. And then storing the waste, you have to store it forever. You have to isolate it from humanity. You have to isolate it from the environment forever. And to do that, it's impossible to calculate the carbon footprint of that. Security, transport, all of that, the back end, none of that has been calculated into the carbon output of nuclear. So it's basically this false idea when you're only looking at that cooling tower, that is essentially false information, and the IPCC and the other agencies that are saying nuclear is clean or green or renewable, they're talking about, when they talk about renewable, this brings into this whole other thing of reprocessing, which is also being proposed in New Mexico. The company that wants to build this nuclear waste dump, they also want to push for reprocessing. So we really need to educate our officials that you can only process waste once, and it's very, it uses a lot of water, it's very energy consumptive. And so all of these things people really don't understand and know about. Essentially, what we know about is the health problems. So when we're talking about all of this climate stuff, we really need to listen to Indigenous communities, not just the human rights aspect, but the cost of cleanup. We haven't even done that. And so I'll just end there. And yeah, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Leona. Jessica, have you and your discussions, your academic or other communities grappled with this problem?
So absolutely. And Leona, thank you so much for that story and what is happening there. It's fascinating. It's interesting. And it's horrifying at the same time. And Hayden, thank you also for your presentation. That was really interesting and good. So in terms of the small, so you're talking about the small, medium nuclear, modular reactors, and because it is like the hot new thing right now. And so in the Arctic, basically you've got like, you have the 3 territories, Northern Quebec, Labrador, a big part. So Nunavut, Northern Quebec, Labrador are virtually cut off completely from, from any other energy grid. So it's creating new sources of energy, in and of itself. And so a lot of the times what we're seeing and the problem and the struggle in the Arctic is, yes, of course, everyone believes that we need to have renewable energy sources. They need to be cleaner, they need to be safer, better. But it's also at the same time, there's this idea though that the Arctic, it reminds me of a lot of my earlier, in my time in Ghana, but my earlier international development work, and this, a little bit around the idea of like small is beautiful. And so if you go to like a lot of different places in African countries, you could see the whole legacy, you could see a lot of the legacies of those development projects that went awry. And so, you see half-built structures, you see this thing that ended up becoming a toilet that was supposed to, like, people were supposed to eat from it and all these type of things. And the same type of thing is happening throughout the Arctic. So instead of investing in like the big fundamental critical infrastructure that's going to create actually, low cost and reliable energy sources, it's more like, well, no, we can't touch the Arctic. We can't, it's pristine. And so, there's like a lot of government incentives and, companies like to do it. Let's go build like 2 windmills or something. And so what happens is you get these investments in windmills. It's not properly studied. It's too windy there. The things fly off, and, and there's like real experiences of this, and all the blades have flown off and everything. And now people are stuck footing the bill of a windmill that doesn't work. Solar is the same. There's, we've seen that some solar projects, had people been convinced to use them, and it's very costly. There's not enough energy that it output, to output it, you can't store it. And so by the time that the solar panels have their end of life, they still haven't really even produced enough energy to actually pay off the cost. And the energy that they have created has been far higher cost, at a far higher cost than even having diesel. That they were trying to get off in the first place. And then of course there's the whole aspect of then what do you do with that? Because then there's the solar, waste, and it's very expensive to put that somewhere, because there's, basically 2 sea lifts that come a year that can take things in and out of the north. And so it's not very easy to dispose of those type of things. And so now, and everyone's running around talking about these small nuclear modular reactors as the next panacea, like we don't need to have gas or any of these other, hydro, whatever. We can use this, and it was interesting and almost made me laugh to myself, actually, because that's what everyone is proposing up north as like the next thing that we should be focused on. And so I do think there's a lot of these same issues. It's going back to the whole thing. How do we decide? It's the trade-offs. So we all want to get to this one place. We all want to get to where we have renewable energy, where it's it's low polluting, it's low cost, it's safe, it's affordable. But there's also, we have to get there. And so what happens in the interim? And I don't think Indigenous people should be like the scapegoats or the guinea pigs, sorry, for like these type of new technologies, and also then end up footing the bill for that, because we've seen that happen over and over and over again in the past, right?
Thank you, Jessica. Hayden, can you tell us about the sorts of conversations you're having with your colleagues and communities? And then Leona, you wanted to bounce back quickly, I think, with a comment, if I understand correctly. Hayden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I just wanted to say before I answered the question directly that Leona might be interested in a case in Ontario, the Saugeen Ojibwe Nations, that were able to use a free prior informed consent process to prevent the burying of nuclear waste in their territory. The first example in a Canadian context where free prior informed consent was applied and actually enforced. And so, we're seeing more of that in a Canadian context, I think, which is also in some ways relevant to these kinds of conversations, because a lot of communities, I take the point that we require energy, and that requires energy production. And so it's not going to be this quick, rapid movement away from, let's say, diesel generators, which by the way, are currently poisoning the city of Iqaluit. There's no drinking water in that city right now because it's, you know, full of gasoline. So, you know, there's not only the climate aspect to this discussion, but there's also, you know, the human health aspect, which of course are related. But I think the conversations that I'm having, Jeffrey, are around energy production and moving away from oil and gas and hydrocarbons and towards renewables and sustainable energy production, is also around consumption, and is also around, you know, maybe for lack of a better word, sacrifice. We as individuals and communities need to look at how we're consuming not only energy, but plastics, and all manner of products, and start looking at behavioral change and cultural change, in addition to just simply thinking we can technologically innovate our ways out of this crisis.
Thanks, Hayden. Leona, and then we'll go to another question.
I was actually going to say almost the same thing as Hayden. Just to back up a little bit, I really appreciate Jessica's comment about always making a choice, because the other day I needed to fill up my car, and I was like, should I support Israel or should I drill in the Arctic? So I just had to take the Shell gas because that was convenient that day. And these are the choices we make in reality. But what Hayden just said, you know, I think we really need to focus the conversation on reducing our consumption of energy, because a lot of the work is toward just transition. Right now, we have a ton of Indigenous peoples in DC making noise in front of the White House to stop fossil fuel extraction. But we need to remember to talk about nuclear. I mean, just for example, in Canada and Australia, there's some places where they rely on diesel generators to do mining because they're not connected to the grid. So I really want to emphasize that we need to talk about reducing our consumption, and this is possible through changes in technology. All of the, what is it called, vampire or the phantom use of energy, like all of the electronics we have, they could be redesigned. There's a lot of ways that we could reduce our consumption that are not being considered or funded right now, that we need to really push on our leaders to do.
Thank you, Leona. I now have a question from one of our students, Marissa Justin, and let me read this question to you. And I don't know if our IT colleagues are able to put the question in front of you, perhaps in the chat feature, but let me read it to you. And what I might do is ask Jessica if you could respond to this first, Hayden second, and then Leona third. So here is the question. It's a fairly short one. Again, thank you so much for your contribution. What efforts have been made in the private sector to include Indigenous voices? Is it your personal opinion that more can be done if Indigenous peoples partner with state actors or private entities? Now, Leona, you've already, I think, touched on that in your last comment, but Jessica, let's start with you, then Hayden, then Leona.
Sure. And Hayden, I'd really be interested to get your thoughts on this too. I think one of the big things is in terms of the private sector, it's the key is having the ability to control and own the narrative and do engagement, like, you know, on your own, like on your own terms. And I think one of the things I've been seeing, there's an interesting coalition. It's called the First Nations Projects Coalition, and they're based out of Western Canada, and it's a group of about 20 First Nations, and they kind of they've come together basically recognizing the idea that the interactions and relations with the government is not getting them anywhere. It's kind of creating a perpetual state of poverty, right, and dependency, and you know, because there's just enough money that basically could keep people like subsistently at a poverty level. And so they realize they have a lot of resources on their lands, and that basically, you know, engaging by becoming equity owners in some of those projects. And a lot of times when you have these big energy projects, it also requires the building of a lot of critical infrastructure around it. So a lot of the supporting infrastructure then is a road, it's an energy system, it's, you know, it's electricity, it's broadband, and all these type of things. And so for them, you know, they feel like, well, for us, like, we need to be able to, you know, spur economic development. And so therefore, if we become equity owners, it's going to lead to economic self-reliance. And I think it's, and it's one, I think, fascinating way that, you know, a lot of First Nations, Indigenous communities are starting to basically try to take control back of, instead of always this, you know, this kind of traditional reliancy on the state, but to have a different relationship than with the private sector, and then to just be able to do things as they wish in that sense. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Jessica. Hayden, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I think private companies have been reluctant, and I shouldn't say reluctant. There's obviously exceptions to engaging and working with Indigenous communities, but a real innovation in Canadian Aboriginal law has occurred throughout the early 2000s, which resulted in this legal principle called the duty to consult. So if there's any development in First Nation, Métis, or Inuit communities' territory, governments have to consult with that community, and if there's a harmful impact, accommodate them for any negative consequences. And so while the duty to consult cannot be offloaded to a third party, i.e., you know, the private sector, that's effectively what has happened now. So we have the oil and gas sector, timber harvesting, even real estate, telecommunications companies that might be building, you know, wireless infrastructure. All these examples of companies that are now saying, okay, the reality is communities have to be consulted on development and brought into the process. And so, as I said, the last decade has really demonstrated some innovation. So we have, you know, equity stakes and joint ventures rather, of the type that Jessica is talking about. We have what are called impact benefit agreements, which is sometimes about sharing resources. We have procurement policies, so that might include hiring an Indigenous janitorial or catering company to do work for the mining staff. So I think you're seeing more and more of that. It depends on the community and the perspective on how these are received. Some think that these are the sort of peanuts of resource extraction and aren't worth it, and so they reject those offers. And then I think the role of the private sector at that point is to respect when the community says no. So if a community says, no, we're not interested in this development, you know, better luck elsewhere or next time, then I think it's the role of the company to respect that decision. We haven't seen that at a general level, or even, you know, there are very few cases where that's been the case. So I think we need to see more of that from the private sector.
Thanks, Hayden. Leona, did you want to come back on this question?
Sure. I just, I think again, I have to go back to my experience as an activist. So I would say in the private sector, I have never seen any efforts made by any industry to include Indigenous voices. Right now, I want to just kind of reiterate what I said about working within the non-government, the NGO sector. So working with nonprofits and non-Indigenous environmental organizations, I know is pretty difficult, because I'm not an environmentalist. I don't do what I do to protect the environment. Some of the mining is on our sacred places, and we're working to protect our cultural resources and those entities that are there. You know, I'm not there because I want to go hiking and that kind of thing. So within the private sector, on that level, within the nonprofits, the nonprofit world, nationally, there's this is a new thing to be including Indigenous voices. I think some groups that work and live near Indigenous communities have that experience to do a better job. But just from my personal opinion and experience across the board, there seems to be a severe lack of education among our white allies. I think that has been prompted mostly by the lies that we were taught in school about colonization, and most people never heard about the Doctrine of Discovery or the Dawes Act or the 1872 mining law. And so all of the history of colonization, when we're talking to NGOs, it's one thing because they want to learn, they want to support, but it's almost the same. It's a different side of the same coin when it's coming to addressing issues of white fragility So when we're trying to address racism directly, we get the same, I've been getting the same pushback from some of my white allies as I do with, pushing back on government and companies. And so it's been a challenge across the board. And this is actually one of the main focuses of my work is to help to engage our non-native allies in a respectful manner. And this is actually one of the hardest parts of what I do. It's easier to yell at the companies and the government, but when you're trying to educate and work with your friends, it can be very challenging.
Thanks so much, Leona. Now, I'm going to just look at the clock. We have a little time management issue here. Our next session starts at the bottom of the hour, and we do have two very interesting questions. And so what I propose is that I'll read the first one from Noe Konago, who, as David mentioned the other day, has been instrumental in putting this panel lineup together and this entire conference together. So I want to ask if perhaps Leona going first, then Hayden, and then Jessica. I'll read the question from Noe, and if you could give a short response to this question, and then I'll follow up by reading Jessica Horton's equally challenging question, but I won't ask you to answer that, but to take away and ponder, and perhaps we can continue that conversation online in one form or another. So here is the question from Noe, and again, I don't know if it can be put in the chat room for you to read, but I'll read it for you now. The three of you have convincingly explained that facing global ecological challenges requires not only determination and resources, but also the due recognition of a plurality of political communities with different experiences, relevant knowledges, competing legitimacies, and not always reconcilable interests. But don't you think that mainstream approaches to global environmental politics rarely focus on these important aspects? Jessica, do you have a short response to this intriguing question from Noe?
The short answer would be yes, I agree completely. I wonder, though, if we're going through a stage where Indigenous people spent a lot of time at the level of the United Nations, for instance, and really fundamentally changed the way we think and understand aspects of international human rights law. And now we have, even Indigenous rights to, self-determination and UNDRIP and everything. I wonder if we're seeing a similar process maybe taking place in the private sector and in terms of regarding climate change. And specifically, going back to what's been, Indigenous voices and in those type of, in the private sector, there's a lot of focus right now on ESG, and there's been a lot of effort by Indigenous communities, First Nations, to actually, so now the focus has gone from the E to the S, the social part, and they're trying to make this argument that it's the S plus I, and then there needs to be really in a way for then Indigenous peoples to be part of what those indicators are and writing those indicators for how we understand the social engagement part, the social aspects of what ESG is about. And so this is early times, days in that conversation, but it's like basically, again, how do they take back, own that narrative, and then therefore make that engagement with Indigenous peoples the way that they want it to be on their own terms.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Hayden, do you have a short response to Noe's question?
The short response is also no. Global environmental politics does not engage with the notion of irreconcilable difference. I think, I think I'm a believer that through, competing interests, there can be a productive tension and results in unique political formations. I think we're far too often focused on the notion of exclusive authority and exclusive jurisdiction. And it sounds like that's been a topic of conversation in the conference already. But, when it comes to global environmental policy, we don't have a lot of time to be fighting over who has the exclusive decision-making power in these arbitrary geographic containers. And I think ultimately Indigenous communities, many Indigenous communities do have solutions to, if not mitigate, adapt to climate change. And so it's at everyone's peril that they are not engaged in these discussions.
Thank you. Leona.
Yeah, I just want to add another layer of complexity. Yes, I agree with the question. And at least for my people, we don't have just one voice when it comes to considering Diné input. We have our grassroots people, the community perspective, we have our medicine people, and then we also have our westernized government, Navajo Nation officials. So even within our own voice or our own perspective, we have divergent and very different interests. And then when you throw in Alaska, I know that's a whole nother complexity with the corporations. So I just wanted to add that in there, that people also neglect is even within our own people, we don't have one, sometimes not one voice.
Thanks so much, Leona. I am going to read very quickly. One of our panelists yesterday, Jessica Horton, left another challenging question, which I'm going to put on the table for future conversation. And Jessica says, building on Hayden King's absolutely essential proposal that diplomacy center relationships to the land, could any of the panelists share their perspective on what it might look like in tangible terms to include the earth at the political negotiating table? What tools are available to listen and converse with more than human partners when building diplomatic relationships? How are Indigenous nations or justice movements modeling such an approach? I am going to send that question out to the panelists with details. And so I think we'll have to continue with that question through an electronic exchange of one sort or another. But let me just finish quickly before we take a 4-minute leg stretch before the next panel, to thank all three of you. Jessica, Hayden, and Leona, this was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for provoking us to think so much about these very, very difficult issues. And I think you've taken our thinking to a much higher level. So thank you very much indeed. We'll see you all at the bottom of the hour.